Have you ever imagined what it might have been like to live as a princess in the medieval world? When we think of princesses, our minds often drift to fairy tale sparkling gowns, majestic castles, and lives filled with endless luxury. Behind the romantic image lies a very different reality, one that was shaped by politics, duty, sacrifice, and sometimes even loneliness. Today, we're going to step back in time and uncover the fascinating and often unexpected truth about what life was really like for a medieval princess. From the moment she was born, a princess's future was already written in the pages of dynastic strategy. Unlike the freedom we take for granted today, her path was rarely her own to choose. Every lesson she learned, every skill she practiced, and every marriage arrangement discussed was not simply for her personal growth, but for the benefit of her family and kingdom. The princess was more than just a daughter of royalty. She was a living symbol of alliance, a bridge between powerful families, and often a pawn in the grand chessboard of medieval politics. Yet, while their lives were full of duty and expectation, these women were far from powerless. Many princesses learned to use their influence in subtle but significant ways. Some acted as trusted advisors to kings, others became skilled mediators during conflicts, and a few rose to positions of true authority, ruling in their own right. Their stories reveal not only the weight of responsibility placed upon them, but also the resilience, intelligence, and courage it took to thrive in a world that often sought to confine them. We'll explore how they were raised, what their daily routines looked like, the challenges they faced in arranged marriages, and the hidden influence they wielded behind palace walls. You'll discover how a princess's life was not always about glittering crowns and grand feasts, but also about personal struggles, dangerous childbirth, and navigating the delicate balance between privilege and restriction. And as we go deeper into this journey, remember that history isn't just about kings, and battles also about the women whose voices and choices shape the world in ways that are still felt today. By understanding the lives of medieval princesses, we gain not only a glimpse into the past, but also a deeper appreciation for the timeless themes of duty, sacrifice, and ambition. Before we begin, I want to invite you to be part of this journey with us. If you enjoyed diving into stories that revealed the hidden truths behind history, don't forget to give this video a like. It really helps us bring more content like this to you. And of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the past. Together, we can continue to uncover the stories that history books often leave untold. Now, let us step inside the castle gates and begin our story of what it truly meant to be a. Although the image of a princess often shines with a glow of romance and charm, the truth of her existence in the medieval world was something far more complex, filled not only with moments of splendor, but also with trials that tested her spirit in ways few could imagine. A princess was born into a web of responsibility that extended far beyond the walls of her castle, and from her earliest days, she would come to understand that her life was not her own to shape freely, but rather one woven tightly into the intricate fabric of political ambitions, family honor, and dynastic survival. Every glance cast upon her, every decision made in her name, and every expectation placed upon her shoulders reminded her that she was not merely a daughter or a sister, but a living emblem of power and alliance, someone whose destiny would ripple across kingdoms and generations. The political world of the Middle Ages was unforgiving, a chessboard where powerful rulers sought to strengthen their realms, not only through armies and conquests, but also through carefully crafted marriages, and the princess stood at the very heart of these strategies. Her hand in marriage was less a matter of affection and more a diplomatic transaction, a bond meant to secure peace between rival lands or to expand influence into distant courts. The thought of romance, which fills the fairy tales we cherish today, was often absent from her reality. For affection could not weigh as heavily as the security of borders, the loyalty of noble families, or the prestige of a stronger alliance. To many, she was the key to stability, a bridge to unite two houses, and though her heart might have yearned for freedom, K-2 was the path she was expected to walk without hesitation. Yet political demands were not the only burdens she carried, for the social expectations surrounding her life could be equally restrictive. A princess was trained from the very moment a princess opened her eyes to the world. She was surrounded by symbols of wealth and privilege that set her apart from ordinary life. Yet this glittering world was never meant to be simply enjoyed for its comforts, because every jewel, every tapestry, every lesson taught within the stone walls of the castle carried with it the weight of expectations that would shape her destiny. Her cradle might have been draped in silks, and her meals served upon golden platters, but alongside these luxuries came a constant reminder that she was not free to drift through life as she pleased, for her identity was tied to her family's honor, her kingdom's prosperity, and the unspoken understanding that she was born to serve a role far greater than herself. From the earliest stages of childhood, she was molded into an image of grace and discipline, her tutors carefully guiding her through lessons that extended far beyond reading and writing. She was expected to understand the sacred teachings of the church, to master courtly etiquette so finely that her very presence could bring dignity to any gathering, and to carry herself with a composure that reflected not only her personal character, but also the strength of the dynasty to which she belonged. Even games or moments of leisure were rarely free of purpose, for they were carefully chosen to develop qualities that would one day make her a suitable bride for a prince or a king, ensuring that when the time came to step into her role, she would embody every virtue demanded of her position. The contrast between her privilege and her responsibility became increasingly clear as she grew older. While she might gaze upon the gardens that stretched endlessly from the castle, its walls, or marvel at the beauty of jewels gifted to her by noble visitors. As the years passed and childhood slowly gave way to the threshold of adulthood, the true purpose of a princess's life began to emerge with greater clarity. For the privileges she had been born into were never meant solely for her enjoyment, but rather to prepare her for the role she was destined to play upon the grand stage of politics, where the fates of entire kingdoms could hinge on her hand in marriage. In an age when wars could be waged for decades and borders were constantly in flux, rulers discovered that a carefully arranged union between noble houses could achieve what swords and armies often could not, and thus the princess became a living promise of peace, a human bond that tied one realm to another through vows spoken before altar and crown. Her marriage was rarely, if ever, a matter of affection or personal choice, for the concerns of her heart could not be weighed against the needs of her dynasty. Instead, her betrothal was carefully planned by fathers, brothers, or advisors who studied maps and treaties, who calculated the strength of alliances and the wealth of dowries, and who saw in her not only a beloved daughter, but also a bridge to power, a link in a chain of strategy that could span across generations. From the moment negotiations began, her name became part of whispered conversations in council chambers. Her future debated in terms of borders, inheritances, and the promise of heirs yet unborn. When the time came to leave her homeland, a princess often carried with her more than fine dresses and precious jewels, for she also bore the expectations of her people, who looked to her as a guarantee of safety and prosperity. The journey to a new court was not simply a change of residence, but a transformation of identity, for she would be expected to understand the reality behind those carefully planned alliances. One must remember that the voices of the princesses themselves were almost never part of the negotiations, for the choice of a husband was seldom theirs to make, and the idea of romantic love as the foundation of marriage was little more than a distant dream reserved for songs and poetry, rather than the lived experience of royalty. Decisions were reached in the privacy of council chambers, where seasoned statesmen, ambitious fathers, and shrewd diplomats weighed political advantages as though there were pieces on a vast chessboard, and once the final agreement was sealed with ink and wax, the fate of the young woman at its center was determined without her ever having been asked what she desired. The moment of revelation often came suddenly, perhaps at the end of a meal when her father beckoned her into his chamber, or during a solemn walk through the castle corridors when she would learn that her life was no longer her own, that she would soon belong to another household in another land, her very identity reshaped to suit the needs of dynastic strategy. For some, the shock was softened by the fact that they had been raised to expect such a destiny. But even so, the weight of knowing that their future had been chosen by others, without even a whisper of their own opinion, could not be ignored. It was a truth that settled heavily on their shoulders, pressing down with the knowledge that from this day forward, every step they took, every word they spoke, every air they produced would be measured against the expectations of two realms. Those who adjusted well were praised as paragons of obedience and virtue. Their willingness to accept the marriage arranged for them cited as proof of their grace and loyalty. Yet behind closed doors, many must have wrestled with uncertainty, fear, or even resentment, for they were often little more than teenagers, scarcely prepared for the responsibilities of a wife. When one looks more closely at the true purpose behind these unions, it becomes clear that marriage for a princess was never a matter of personal happiness, but an instrument of statecraft, a carefully chosen thread woven into the fabric of political strategy, designed to bind kingdoms together in peace, or to secure the loyalty of powerful, noble houses whose support was essential for a ruler's survival. Every wedding was a declaration written not only in vows but in treaties, promises, and the subtle yet binding language of diplomacy. For a princess was the embodiment of her family's honor and her homeland's ambitions, offered as a living pledge that oaths made between monarchs would hold true. To those outside the royal courts, the sight of a lavish ceremony, the procession of silks and jewels, and the grand feasts with overflowing wine might appear to be celebrations of joy. Yet beneath the glitter of gold and the music of trumpets lay the reality that each carefully staged moment was meant to signal strength, wealth, and unity. The very presence of the bride was a statement to rival powers, a reminder that bloodlines had been merged and interests aligned, and that the cost of breaking such a bond would be far greater than the reward of betrayal. In this way, the princess was not simply a bride, but a symbol, a living treaty dressed in silk, whose worth was measured less by her own desires than by the alliances she secured. For noble families too, the arrangement of marriage was a powerful tool, ensuring their survival and influence in a world where fortune could change with the rise and fall of kings. A daughter's hand in marriage could elevate a house from obscurity to prominence, or safeguard its position in turbulent times. Thus, every decision was weighed with care. Every negotiation carried layers of consequence. For in an era when wars could devastate entire generations, well-placed marriage often meant the difference between ruin and prosperity. And though the princess herself may have had little say in these choices, the ripple of her presence, what often lay hidden beneath the splendor of these alliances, was the quiet truth that a princess's own hopes and happiness mattered far less than the political advantages her marriage could deliver, for, in the eyes of kings and counselors, her heart was not hers to protect, but a resource to be invested, traded, and sometimes sacrificed in pursuit of power. While songs and poems of the time spoke of love's triumph and the beauty of affection, the lives of royal daughters told a different story, one where affection was a luxury rarely afforded, and duty was the guiding principle that shaped every step of their existence. Imagine the weight of living under such circumstances, to grow up surrounded by wealth and privilege, yet always knowing that the future would not be defined by your dreams, but by the shifting needs of diplomacy, and that the warmth of companionship or the comfort of choosing a partner might never be yours to claim. Some young women accepted this with grace, believing that obedience to family and crown was not only expected, but sacred, while others endured it in silence, carrying with them the ache of suppressed longing and the quiet grief of knowing that their lives were mapped out by forces beyond their control. This did not mean that every princess lived in sorrow or despair, for some discovered genuine affection within the marriages arranged for them, while others learned to take pride in the influence and security their unions created for their kingdoms. Yet, even in these more fortunate cases, their happiness was always bound by the condition that it must serve a greater purpose, that their joy, if it came, was secondary to the survival and prosperity of their house. Their private wishes could never outweigh the expectations of a dynasty that depended on their role as wife, mother, and mediator between two realms. To be a princess, then, was to master the art of endurance, to wear a serene smile, while concealing the weight of unspoken thoughts. Beyond the marriage vows and the careful weaving of alliances, there loomed another duty that weighed heavily on the shoulders of every princess turned queen or consort. For once she crossed the threshold into her new role, the expectation was clear and unyielding. She must give her husband heirs, and not just children in general, but sons, strong and healthy boys who could carry the family name, inherit the crown, and ensure the continuity of dynastic stability in a world where succession crises often meant civil war, betrayal, and bloodshed. A woman's worth within the palace walls was measured not only by her grace and conduct, but by the children she bore. And behind every smile of celebration at a royal christening lay the unspoken relief that another thread had been secured in the fragile web of political order. The pressure was immense, for a princess who failed to fulfill this expectation risked more than whispers in the corridors. She faced the possibility of being cast aside, replaced, or blamed for misfortunes that were often beyond her control. The health of her womb was tied to the fate of nations, and each passing year, without an heir, brought with it a rising tide of anxiety, not only for her, but for the advisors and monarchs who saw in her body the very future of their lineage. In this way, the most private aspects of her life became matters of public importance, scrutinized by courtiers, chroniclers, and the ever-watchful eyes of rival houses eager to exploit weakness. To give birth to a son was considered a triumph, a victory, not only for the mother, but for the entire dynasty, for with each male heir the line of succession grew stronger, the crown more secure, and the realm more stable in the eyes of allies and enemies alike. Daughters, though often cherished privately, were less celebrated. Their arrivals met with polite smiles rather than the jubilant processions that welcomed a boy, for everyone understood, long before a princess was old enough to stand at the altar and seal the fate of kingdoms, her life was carefully shaped through an education designed not to encourage personal ambition, but to prepare her for the roles that awaited her. From the earliest days of her childhood, tutors, governesses, and sometimes even priests or nuns surrounded her, ensuring that every lesson she absorbed contributed to the refinement of a future consort who could carry herself with dignity in any court across Europe. Language study was often among the first priorities, for a princess might be sent to a foreign land where a native tongue would be of little use, and her ability to converse in Latin, French, or even the dialect of her betrothed's homeland was considered as vital as any dowry. Words, after all, could be as powerful as armies, and a princess fluent in multiple tongues could charm, persuade, or soothe tensions in ways that swords could not. Alongside these practical studies came the art of etiquette, a discipline that extended far beyond knowing which fork to use at a banquet or how deeply to curtsy before a king. Courtly behavior was a language in itself, a silent form of diplomacy where posture, gestures, and even the tone of one's laughter could communicate loyalty, respect, or insult. A princess was trained to move with deliberate grace, to bow or rise at the precise moment, to carry herself in such a way that she reflected honor not only upon herself, but upon her family and her nation. In a world where a single misstep could spark offense and offense could spark war, etiquette was not merely ornamented with survival. Religion, too, occupied a central place in her education, for faith shaped every aspect of medieval life and provided the moral framework by which queens and princesses were judged. They were expected not only to observe rituals with devotion, but also to embody piety, serving as examples of virtue within the palace and beyond. The lessons in language etiquette and the arts, there were occasions when the education of a princess reached into far weightier matters, for not all royal daughters were destined merely to adorn a foreign court or to remain in the background of their husband's reign. In some families, particularly where bloodlines were fragile or political circumstances uncertain, a princess might be trained in the intricacies of politics and governance, a preparation not only for the possibility of becoming a queen consort, but, in certain cases, for ruling in her own right or acting as regent when her husband or son was absent or too young to wield authority. This kind of training was rare and often reserved for those born into dynasties where necessity demanded it. Yet, when it occurred, it revealed just how far-reaching the responsibilities of a royal daughter could be. Such instruction was never casual. Learned advisors, seasoned counselors, and sometimes even monarchs themselves would oversee her lessons, teaching her to read charters and decrees, to understand the delicate balance of feudal obligations, and to recognize the subtleties of diplomacy where a misinterpreted gesture or a poorly chosen word could unravel years of negotiation. She might be taught to calculate taxes, to listen to petitions, and to dispense judgments with a sense of fairness tempered by political awareness. The ability to govern wisely was not simply an adornment, but a weapon, one that could hold a realm together when storms of rebellion or invasion threatened to tear it apart. For these princesses, the expectations were daunting. For the weight of governance demanded more than grace or beauty, demanded intellect, resilience, and the ability to see beyond the splendor of courtly life into the harsher realities of power, to walk into a even though traditions sought to confine them within the gilded boundaries of their roles as wives, mothers, and symbols of dynastic unity. There were women who managed to step beyond those limits, bending the expectations of their age without openly pitting them, and in doing so, they carved out spaces of real power for themselves in the spheres of politics and diplomacy. These princesses understood that influence did not always require a crown placed upon their head or an army sworn to their command. Instead, they wielded softer weapons: persuasion, intelligence, charisma, and patience, turning the very skills meant to make them ornamental into instruments of authority. At times, their voices guided kings from behind the throne, whispered counsel, shaping decisions that determined the fate of realms. In other cases, they acted as negotiators in their own right, leveraging their family ties to broker peace between warring factions, or arranging marriages for their children that secured alliances more lasting than any treaty drafted by men. Their letters, delicately phrased yet filled with subtle power, traveled across borders as tools of diplomacy, proving that a woman's pen could carry as much weight as a soldier's sword. Some princesses were dispatched to foreign courts as intercessors, their very presence a reminder of kinship between rival dynasties, and through tact and charm they soothed tempers that might otherwise have flared into conflict. History records figures like Margaret of Austria, who, as regent, governed the Netherlands with remarkable skill, or Catherine of Aragon, who acted as Spain's ambassador in England long before she became its queen, demonstrating that their abilities extended far beyond the domestic sphere. Such examples show that even within a world designed to restrict them, determined women found ways to rise. Proof among the most delicate yet vital roles entrusted to princesses was their ability to act as mediators in times of conflict for their bloodlines. Tied together, rival houses and their marriages often linked kingdoms that might otherwise have stood as enemies. In this unique position, allowed them to serve as bridges where men armed with steel could find no path forward. A princess with her dual loyalties to the land of her birth and to the court of her marriage often carried within her the fragile hope that peace might prevail. And it was through her voice, her presence, and her careful diplomacy that tensions were softened and bloodshed at times averted. In moments of crisis, she might be called upon to plead for restraint, to remind both sides of the kinship that bound them together, or to negotiate terms that allowed pride to be preserved, even as swords were sheathed. These interventions were rarely dramatic in the way battles filled the chronicles, yet their quiet impact was profound, for the calming influence of a princess could halt feuds that had dragged on for generations or turn potential wars into carefully worded treaties. It was not unusual for correspondence to pass through her hands, each line crafted with care so as not to give offense, each word chosen to carry the weight of persuasion without the sting of accusation. Her role as mediator was more than symbolic. In some courts, she physically stood between factions, inviting both sides to the table with a grace that disarmed hostility. Her presence reminding all involved that there was more at stake than immediate victory. That the unity of realms, the safety of subjects, and the honor of dynasties depended on finding common ground. These moments required not only intelligence, but immense courage, for to mediate was to risk displeasing one side or both, and yet beyond their influence in matters of peace and conflict, many princesses found another avenue through which to leave an enduring mark upon the world: the cultivation of art, literature, and religious devotion. Though their political actions were often shaped by necessity, their patronage was where their individuality could shine for and supporting. Artists, writers, architects, and spiritual leaders, they shaped the cultural soul of their kingdoms in ways that outlived even the dynasties they were born to serve. A court, graced by the hand of an intelligent and discerning princess, became not only a center of power, but a beacon of refinement, where the beauty of the human spirit was allowed to flourish alongside the harsh realities of politics. In grand halls and cloisters, their patronage gave birth to illuminated manuscripts, intricate tapestries, and sacred works of architecture that still inspire all centuries later. They commissioned chapels whose stained glass windows bathed worshippers in colored light, and they endowed monasteries and convents where faith could thrive, ensuring that their legacy was not confined to treaties or alliances, but inscribed upon stone, parchment, and melody. A princess who supported poets and scholars might transform her court into a sanctuary of learning, where ideas crossed borders with as much significance as armies, and where the rhythm of a lute or the lines of a carefully crafted verse carried messages as enduring as any royal decree. Such acts were not mere indulgence in beauty, for in a time when rulers derived authority not only from strength, but also from divine favor and cultural prestige, patronage was a powerful tool of influence. A princess who could gather learned men and women around her, who could fill her halls with the resonance of sacred hymns and the brilliance of painted icons, elevated the stature of her husband. This reign and lent an aura of sophistication and holiness to the dynasty. Through their choices, they guided not only the spiritual life of their subjects, but also the way their realm was perceived by allies. The ability of these royal women to shape culture was not accidental, but rooted in the very wealth and status that surrounded them for a while. Ordinary nobles might sponsor a chapel or commission a single poem. A princess with the resources of kingdoms at her disposal could transform entire courts into thriving centers of art and thought. Her presence alone elevated the prestige of gatherings, and her tastes set the tone for what was considered fashionable, elegant, or worthy of imitation. When she chose to favor certain musicians, painters, or scholars, their reputations soared, and with them, the cultural landscape of her adopted land shifted, guided by the quiet hand of a woman who, though bound by duty, still found room to leave her personal mark upon history. It was in these carefully curated circles that new styles of music flourished, where the poetic ideals of courtly love were refined into verses that echoed across generations, and where architecture was infused with grandeur to reflect both divine inspiration and royal authority. A single commission from a princess could result in a tapestry depicting not only biblical tales, but subtle reminders of dynastic glory, or in a book of hours so lavishly decorated that it became both a tool of devotion and a symbol of a kingdom's wealth. Her choices did more than decorate palaces. They defined eras, leaving cultural imprints that were as enduring as stone castles and as influential as political alliances. In many ways, the cultural power they wielded was a softer, yet more lasting form of diplomacy. A richly adorned court where music filled the air and artists found patronage sent a message to foreign visitors just as surely as any treaty. Here was a dynasty not only strong in arms, but refined in spirit, a realm where faith, learning, and beauty, though the wealth and prestige surrounded them, could create the illusion of a charmed existence. The reality was that the lives of princesses often carried a shadow that no jewels or silks could conceal. For behind the glittering halls and the finely woven tapestries lay the very real possibility of isolation, loneliness, or even the bitter sting of exile. To be married into a foreign land was to leave behind one's childhood home, its family, and the language of comfort, stepping instead into a place where every word, gesture, and custom was scrutinized and often judged. A princess who crossed borders to secure alliances might be celebrated publicly, yet in private she could feel the crushing weight of solitude, cut off from those who had once given her strength and surrounded instead by courtiers who saw her as an outsider, a pawn, or even a threat. The sense of displacement could be overwhelming. Imagine being barely more than a teenager, carried by ceremonial processions into a foreign court, where whispers trailed behind you in a tongue not yet mastered, where every glance seemed to measure your worth, not as a person, but as a vessel of alliance and lineage. Letters sent home might take months to arrive, and replies even longer, if they came at all. And in those long silences, the young woman, once a cherished daughter, found herself confronting the deep loneliness that no feasts or finery could truly ease. Some endured it with grace, adapting slowly to their new world, while others withered under its coldness, their health and spirits broken by the relentless distance from everything familiar. Exile, too, was an ever-present danger. A princess who failed to fulfill expectations, whether by producing heirs, by navigating court politics, or simply by falling out of favor, could find herself cast aside, her rank unable to shield her from disgrace. History holds many such stories, of women sent back to their homelands in humiliation or confined to distant estates where their voices carried no power. To be exiled was not merely to lose comfort, but if the loneliness of their position weighed heavily, the unrelenting scrutiny under which they lived added yet another invisible chain. For every gesture, every word, and even the slightest expression upon a princess's face could be interpreted as a statement of loyalty, defiance, or scandal. Unlike those around them who might stumble in private and recover unnoticed, the life of a royal woman unfolded beneath a constant gaze, as though she moved across a stage where her audience never ceased to watch, judge, and whisper. Courtiers noted how she dressed, who she spoke to, how she carried herself in moments of ceremony, and whether she adhered to the codes of decorum expected of her rank. And while such attention might appear flattering to some, in reality it created a suffocating atmosphere in which authenticity was a risk too great to take. A misplaced glance toward a favored noble could spark rumors of betrayal. A word spoken too freely might be twisted into defiance. And even the smallest breach of etiquette had the power to ripple into scandal. For in courts where rival factions vied for influence, gossip was not mere idle chatter, but a weapon sharpened to wound reputations and shift alliances. A princess who failed to guard her behavior became easy prey for those who wished to undermine her position or tarnish her family standing, and so she learned early that her reputation was not her own, but a fragile banner carried on behalf of her dynasty. This vigilance extended far beyond formal events. Even in private chambers, trusted servants might relay observations to those eager for advantage, ensuring that very little of her life was truly her own. Friendships could be dangerous if forged with the wrong person. Laughter could be interpreted as frivolity, and silence could be painted as arrogance or rebellion. The constant need to perform a role drained many, yet it also forged in some a remarkable discipline. For to survive such an environment required an almost instinctive awareness of every word, movement, and alliance. And yet, behind the polished exterior that so many presented, there often lived, if reputation acted as both safeguard and burden, then the measure of a princess's worth, in the eyes of her contemporaries, rested heavily upon qualities that reduced her vast potential to a narrow frame: her chastity, her ability to bear children, and her willingness to submit to the demands of family and crown. From the moment she entered the world, her life was charted along a path that prized purity as a political commodity for a woman. Its virtue was unquestioned, could be offered as a bond of trust between kingdoms, while even the faintest shadow of impropriety could unravel delicate negotiations and diminish her family's standing. This expectation meant that a princess's body itself was treated as an extension of the realm, its honor inseparable from that of her dynasty. In marriage, her fertility was not only a private hope, but a public obligation for producing heirs, preferably strong sons, who could secure the continuity. Kawa was seen as the truest measure of her success. Each pregnancy carried the weight of dynastic stability, and with it came both immense pressure and genuine peril, for childbirth in the medieval world was fraught with risk, often leaving women in constant fear of what might unfold behind the heavy curtains of the birthing chamber. Success brought praise, while misfortune could invite blame, no matter how unfair the circumstances. Equally binding was the demand for obedience, a quality lauded above wit, spirit, or ambition. For in a society ruled by patriarchal structures, a compliant princess was considered more valuable than a questioning one. She was expected to follow the will of her father before marriage, then transferred that loyalty seamlessly to her husband, embodying a perfect image of grace, submission, and loyalty, regardless of her own desires or thoughts. To deviate from this script was to court scandal, resistance, or even political disaster. And yet, behind this strict mold into which she was pressed, many princesses possessed keen intellects, sharp instincts, and unspoken strength, qualities that often surfaced in subtle ways, hidden beneath layers of formality and restraint. They learned to navigate expectations with quiet resilience, balancing the fine line, but even the glittering walls of a palace could not shield a princess from the harsh realities of her age. For beneath the silks and jewels lay a fragile humanity as vulnerable as any peasant's. Disease did not bow to titles, nor did it respect crowns, and the corridors of medieval courts were often shadowed by the presence of illness. Plagues swept through kingdoms with merciless speed, carrying away both commoner and noble alike, while fevers, infections, and mysterious ailments claimed lives with little warning. Physicians at the time, bound by limited knowledge, relied on remedies that often did more harm than good, leaving even the most privileged households helpless when sickness struck. Childbirth, which was already fraught with immense danger, became one of the leading causes of mortality for royal women, its risks magnified by the expectation to produce multiple heirs. A successful delivery was celebrated not only as a personal triumph, but as a victory for the dynasty itself. While tragedy within the birthing chamber sent ripples of instability through an entire realm, and beyond the risks of childbirth loomed the threat of epidemics, smallpox, tuberculosis, and countless unnamed fevers that could decimate courts within weeks, striking down kings, queens, and their children, sometimes leaving dynasties hanging by a thread. The ever-present specter of death shaped the atmosphere of royal life, creating a paradox where immense privilege coexisted with constant fragility. Royal families commissioned elaborate chapels and endowed religious institutions, not merely from piety, but from an almost desperate hope that prayers might shield them from the invisible forces that so often claimed their loved ones. Behind the public pageantry of processions and ceremonies was the quiet reality of mourning chambers, black-draped halls, and dynasties scrambling to secure succession before grief had even settled. For a princess, this meant that every aspect of her existence carried an undertone of impermanence. Among the gravest shadows that lingered over the lives of medieval princesses, none loomed larger than the dangers of childbirth, for in an era without modern medicine, what should have been a moment of joy often became a perilous crossing between life and death. These young women, celebrated for their marriages and burdened with the duty of continuing dynasties, frequently entered the birthing chamber, not with the confidence of safety, but with the solemn awareness, that their survival was uncertain. Behind the heavy wooden doors, surrounded by attendants, midwives, and priests, every labor was a gamble, and no amount of wealth, status, or divine prayer could guarantee the outcome. The risks were many: hemorrhage, infection, prolonged labor, or complications that no physician of the age could truly understand. The whispered prayers of courtiers waiting outside the chamber were as much for the life of the mother as for the child, for the death of a princess in childbirth carried consequences that rippled beyond the personal grief of her family. Dynasties could be thrown into chaos, alliances could weaken, and carefully balanced politics could unravel in the wake of her absence. It was not uncommon for princesses to die before reaching the age of 30, their lives cut short by the very duty that defined their worth in the eyes of the world. For those who survived one birth, the cycle often repeated again and again. Its pregnancy carrying its own risks, each childbearing demanded by duty rather than choice. The haunting reality was that joy and sorrow often arrived hand in hand. A healthy heir could bring celebration across the kingdom, yet the mother might not live to see the child grow her name spoken in mourning, even as bells rang in triumph. In this way, the most intimate, yet, despite the dangers, the grief, the suffocating expectations placed upon them, history reminds us that not every princess accepted a life defined by obedience and sacrifice, for there were those who, armed with intelligence, ambition, and sheer force of will, chose to carve their own paths, challenging the traditions that sought to confine them. These women understood the game of power as keenly as any king or nobleman, and while some operated within the subtle confines of diplomacy and persuasion, others stepped boldly into roles that courts and chroniclers often reserved for men. They mastered the art of influence, using marriage not as a chain but as a key, transforming alliances into platforms from which they could extend their reach. Where one princess might have been remembered only for the heirs she bore, another etched her name into history by seizing opportunities to govern in her husband's absence, by negotiating treaties that secured peace, or by shaping courtly culture into an instrument of soft power. In times of crisis, some acted as regents, ruling in the name of their sons or brothers, yet in truth exercising authority with a decisiveness that rivaled any monarch. Their voices carried weight in council chambers, their strategies determined the fate of armies, and their presence in diplomacy reshaped the balance of kingdoms. Such defiance did not always take the form of overt rebellion. Often it lived in quiet resistance, in the refusal to be silenced, in the choice to nurture networks of allies, poets, clerics, and commanders who could strengthen their position. At times, it emerged in acts of daring independence, whether in taking control of estates, defending inheritance rights, or even leading troops into battle when the moment demanded courage beyond expectation. These princesses revealed that beneath the veneer of submissive elegance lay a reservoir of resilience, and history offers luminous reminders that some princesses did not merely endure the roles carved out for them, but transcended them, rising to wield crowns of their own, or to guide kingdoms as regents in times of uncertainty. Far from passive figures tucked away in the margins of chronicles, these women stepped into the very heart of power. Their names carried through the centuries as proof that the medieval world, though bound by rigid structures, could not entirely silence the will of those determined to rule. When a king fell in battle or died unexpectedly, leaving behind heirs too young to claim the throne, it was often a mother who assumed the mantle of authority, steering the realm through turbulent waters until her child came of age. In these moments, the princess turned queen or regent revealed a strength that had long been underestimated. Balancing the demands of governance with the delicate task of preserving dynastic legitimacy, they negotiated with nobles, quelled rebellions, commanded treasuries, and made decisions that shaped the destiny of nations, all while under the watchful eye of courtiers eager to question their right to lead. For some, the crown came not as an accident or circumstance, but as the prize of ambition, seized through strategy, alliance, or even sheer defiance. These were women who refused to fade into the background, who stepped forward when power called, unafraid to claim authority in their own names rather than through the shadows of husbands or sons. They understood the precariousness of their position, aware that failure would invite scorn while success could inspire respect. Yet they accepted the risk, proving that courage was not the sole province of kings. Their stories, often preserved in chronicles written by men who struggled to reconcile admiration with unease, revealed the depth of their political acumen, whether ruling from thrones or council chambers. These princesses, turned queens and regents, reshaped expectations of what royal women. What becomes most striking when reflecting upon the lives of these princesses is the constant tension they embodied. A delicate balance between extraordinary privilege and suffocating restriction, for they lived at the very center of power, yet often found themselves chained by the very traditions that granted them their rank. Their days unfolded within splendid halls filled with art, music, and ceremony. Yet the gilded beauty of such surroundings concealed the reality that their freedom of choice was far narrower than that of many who lived beyond palace walls. They were adorned in silks and jewels, their names whispered with reverence across kingdoms, yet, even as they stood, the pinnacle of noble life, their futures were shaped less by their own desires and more by the will of fathers, husbands, and councils of men. The privileges they enjoyed, fine education, access to wealth, a role in the great theater of dynastic politics, were inseparable from the expectations that defined them, binding them to roles that prized loyalty and obedience above independence and self-expression. It was a paradox few could escape. The higher they climbed in rank, the tighter the web of scrutiny and obligation became. To walk as a princess in the medieval world was to live constantly at the crossroads of luxury and sacrifice, of honor and danger, of reverence and restraint. The grandeur of courtly life offered them power to influence culture, politics, and even the fates of nations, but it also demanded that they surrender much of themselves in return. Their stories, therefore, are neither simple tales of suffering nor straightforward triumphs of privilege, but rather intricate portraits of women who carried the weight of expectation with grace, who endured hardship while adorned in splendor, and who navigated a life where freedom and captivity existed side by side. Even centuries later, the echoes of their lives linger woven into the fabric of how we imagine royalty and womanhood for the tales of medieval princesses have not remained locked in the dusty pages of chronicles, but have instead seeped into legend, literature, and the collective imagination. Their stories, at times tragic, at times triumphant, have become archetypes, shaping the way we think about crowns, castles, and the women who wore them. In many ways, the modern idea of a princess, whether idealized in fairy tales or dramatized in historical retellings, is built upon the foundations laid by their real experiences that were far more complex than the polished myths suggest. When we hear the word princess, images of beauty, grace, and elegance often come to mind, Yet these qualities, celebrated in modern culture, draw deeply from the traditions imposed upon medieval women of rank. At the same time, the struggles they endured, arranged marriages, the dangers of childbirth, the constant surveillance of their behavior have quietly informed the enduring narrative that femininity carries both power and burden. In stories passed down through generations, they became symbols of duty and sacrifice, their lives repurposed into lessons about loyalty, virtue, and resilience, even as the harsher truths of their existence were often softened or reshaped to fit more romantic ideals. The fascination endures because their lives bridge the gap between myth and reality. They remind us that behind every legend of a flawless princess locked in a tower or rescued by a knight lies the memory of a real woman who may have wielded influence, suffered loss, defied convention, or carried her dynasty upon her shoulders. Modern portrayals, whether in novels, films, or popular culture, continue to oscillate between fantasy and history, painting them as both symbols of idealized femininity and figures of strength who defied their circumstances. In this way, medieval princesses live on not only as distant figures of the past, but as enduring touchstones for how we understand royalty, womanhood, and the balance between freedom and duty. Their legacy reminds us that beneath the crowns and courtly rituals were human beings whose choices and struggles still resonate with themes of identity, sacrifice, and ambition, stories as compelling today as they were when first lived centuries ago. Whereas today's royal figures often command vast public attention with speeches, charitable causes, and a cultivated sense of individuality, their medieval counterparts lived within far narrower boundaries, their voices muffled by the rigid structures of their age, and their actions scrutinized through the lens of obedience and decorum. A princess in the Middle Ages could not step into a crowd to express her own opinions, nor could she publicly shape policy in her own name without inviting whispers of impropriety or rebellion, for her world did not permit such visibility. Her presence was carefully managed, her words measured, and her very identity woven into the image her family or kingdom required her to project. Public freedom as we understand it now scarcely existed for her, for even beyond the palace gates, her movements were controlled, her encounters curated, and her role reduced to ceremonial appearances that reinforced her family's power rather than reflected her individuality. She was expected to be seen as a symbol rather than heard as a person, a living emblem of loyalty, purity, and dynastic strength, and any hint of personal voice that strayed beyond those confines could be perceived as dangerous. Where modern royals might use interviews or philanthropy to carve an independent legacy, medieval princesses navigated an existence in which silence was safer than candor, and conformity more valuable than authenticity. Yet this silence should not be mistaken for absence, for though they lacked the freedom to speak openly, many learned to shape influence in the quiet spaces between words and gestures that escaped notice in carefully chosen alliances or in a cultural and religious patronage that allowed them to leave a lasting mark without challenging the public expectations that hemmed them in. Their lack of visible freedom only heightens the significance of the legacies they managed to build, proving that even without the open platforms available to modern royals, they found ways to ensure their voices, however subtle, echoed through time. In the end, their constrained existence illuminates the vast gulf between the medieval and the modern, reminding us that the glittering crowns and flowing gowns so often associated with princesses came at the cost of invisibility, silence, and an endless balancing act between duty and desire. Where modern figures may thrive on public connection, medieval princesses survived by perfecting the art of restraint, turning necessity into strength, and silence into a form of endurance that is as telling of their world as any crown they ever wore. Beneath the grandeur of palaces and the weight of jeweled crowns, the lives of medieval princesses reveal with stark clarity the narrow boundaries within which women of their era were expected to exist, for their high birth elevated them above most, yet did little to grant them true authority over their own destinies. Its agency, the freedom to choose one's path, was a privilege they seldom tasted. And though their names were etched into treaties, marriage contracts, and dynastic records, the voices behind those signatures were often silenced or ignored. As their rank, paradoxically, magnified both their visibility and their confinement, reminding us that status in medieval society was not always synonymous with power. A princess could influence the fortunes of kingdoms, yet she could not freely decide whom she would marry, where she would live, or how she might spend her days. Her wealth and education offered refinement and opportunity, but these gifts served the interests of her family and realm more than her own desires. Even when she rose to the role of queen or regent, her actions were constantly questioned, her legitimacy scrutinized, her decisions attributed to the men who surrounded her rather than to her own intelligence or will. In this way, her experience mirrored the broader condition of women in her society, who, regardless of class, were expected to submit to male authority and to accept a life circumscribed by duty. What makes the story of these royal women so compelling is that their struggles underscore a universal truth of the medieval world, that even those with extraordinary privilege were still bound by the iron chains of custom and tradition. Their castles might have been larger, their gowns finer, their influence more visible, yet their ability to direct their own lives was scarcely greater than that of countless women whose names history did not preserve. This contrast between rank and agency reveals the essence of their paradox. It's a life filled with splendor and yet constrained by forces beyond their control. And still, within these confines, some found ways to bend the rules, to assert their presence in subtle but meaningful ways, proving that the human spirit seeks expression even under restriction. Their endurance and occasional defiance stand as quiet testaments to resilience, reminding us that the experience of medieval princesses was not simply one of privilege or confinement, but of a constant negotiation between the two, a negotiation that reflects the broader limitations faced by women of their time, regardless of how brightly their crowns might have gleamed. To truly understand the arc of a medieval princess's existence, one must look beyond the surface of glittering coronations and splendid banquets to the deeper forces that defined her life. For beneath the silks and jewels lay a path marked less by personal desire than by obligation to family, faith, and realm. Every decision that touched her future, from the day she was born to the moment she became part of another household through marriage, was carefully woven into the grand tapestry of dynastic politics, and within that design, she was both a symbol and a sacrifice. Her duty was not merely to live with dignity, but to embody the ambitions of her lineage, to uphold alliances crafted in council chambers, and to produce heirs whose existence would secure the continuity of a throne. The weight of this role often meant that personal happiness, private dreams, and even the natural rhythms of life were secondary to the relentless demands of politics. A young princess might long for freedom or companionship of her own choosing, yet her marriage would be arranged with the precision of a military campaign, her journeys dictated by treaties, her children viewed as living bonds between rival courts. To the world outside, she was cherished and celebrated, yet within the walls of her chambers, she carried the quiet knowledge that her own wishes were seldom the deciding factor in her destiny. The very love she bore for her family, the sacrifices she endured in their name, and the endless duties pressed upon her shoulders were constant reminders that her identity was inseparable from the vast machinery of power. And yet, within this strict web of expectation, there emerged moments of subtle influence, flashes of individuality that reveal how these women, even when confined, could leave their mark upon history. Some navigated the intricacies of diplomacy with keen intelligence. Others used faith and patronage of the arts to project authority. And a few rare figures seized opportunities to rule in their own right, demonstrating that even under the heaviest weight of tradition, determination could find a way to assert itself. Still, for most, life was a continuous balance between public duty and private sacrifice, a testament to endurance in the face of forces that stretched far beyond their control. When we look back at these women today, it is impossible not to see both the grandeur and the burden of their lives. Their existence was elevated above that of ordinary people, yet at the same time more heavily constrained by dynastic ambition. And in this tension lies the true essence of their story, a life of privilege and splendor, yet also of constant service, where every choice was shaped by the needs of others, and every sacrifice became part of the long legacy of kingdoms rising and falling across the medieval world. The life of a medieval princess was far from the glittering fantasy often painted in fairy tales, for though she might have worn crowns of gold and gowns woven with the finest silks, her existence was bound by chains of duty, sacrifice, and the unyielding demands of dynastic politics. Born into privilege, yet burdened with responsibility, she was both a cherished daughter of her realm and a pawn. Teed the vast chessboard of European power. Her every step measured her every choice, overshadowed by expectations that reached far beyond her own desires. From the very moment of her birth, her future was scripted, not in the ink of personal freedom, but in the bold strokes of political necessity. And though she might dream of love or independence, her destiny was shaped by alliances that carried the weight of kingdoms upon her shoulders. At the heart of her role lay marriage, a union seldom founded upon affection, but instead designed to strengthen the fragile bonds between rival courts, to ease centuries of tension, or to seal a treaty that would redirect the course of nations. A princess rarely chose her partner. Instead, her hand was promised in whispered negotiations across candlelit chambers, her future husband, a symbol of opportunity or compromise. To her family, She was a bridge to power, a living embodiment of their ambition. And while her personal happiness was often a distant consideration, her ability to produce heirs, especially sons, was treated as the cornerstone of dynastic survival. Every birth she endured was not merely a moment of joy or fear, but a political act. And every child she brought into the world represented both the continuation of her bloodline and the fulfillment of her role. Yet even as she shouldered this burden, her days were not consumed solely by marriage and motherhood. From an early age, she was instructed in the languages of diplomacy, the etiquette of the court, and the sacred teachings of her faith. Some received training in governance, preparing them to act as advisors or even rulers when circumstances demanded it. Others found their influence in subtler ways, acting as mediators during moments of conflict, smoothing tensions between quarreling nobles, or guiding their husbands and sons with quiet but steady wisdom. For these women, the constraints of their roles did not extinguish their capacity to shape events. Rather, it forced them to wield influence in ways both delicate and enduring, carving spaces of power within the very limitations designed to contain them. Beyond politics, many princesses became champions of culture, lending their wealth and protection to artists, poets, musicians, and religious institutions. Their courts became centers of beauty and learning, where illuminated manuscripts were crafted, sacred music composed, and architectural wonders raised toward the heavens. Through these acts of patronage, they ensured that their names would echo not only in treaties and genealogies, but also in the enduring heritage of art and faith. Their lives, though constrained, became conduits through which creativity and devotion were nurtured, leaving behind legacies that reached far beyond their own time. But beneath the splendor, the shadows remained. Isolation, loneliness, and even exile could haunt their lives. For a princess was not only scrutinized by her family and subjects, but also judged by her every word, gesture, and decision. Her worth was measured in her virtue, her fertility, her obedience. And when she faltered, her, when misfortune struck her, fall from grace could be swift and merciless. Illness claimed many lives in an age before modern medicine, and childbirth in particular was a perilous trial that carried away countless young mothers before they could see their children grow. To be a princess was to live with the knowledge that even the highest status offered no immunity from the frailty of the human body, no escape from the ever-present specter of death. And yet, not all chose to submit quietly to these boundaries. History remembers the women who defied convention, who seized crowns in their own right, or acted as regents with a power that rivaled kings. They reveal to us that even within a world designed to limit them, courage and ambition could carve unexpected paths. Their stories remind us that medieval princesses were not passive figures, but complex individuals who navigated a life balanced precariously between privilege and restriction, expectation and self-determination. In the end, the tale of the medieval princess is not one of castles and dreams, but of endurance, sacrifice, and resilience. Their experiences expose the harsh realities of a society that granted them jewels and titles, but denied them the freedom to live as they wished. And yet, through their marriages, their children, their diplomacy, their patronage, and their occasional defiance, they left behind a legacy that continues to shape how we think about royalty, womanhood, and power. Their lives were not simple stories of romance or luxury, but profound lessons in the human struggle to balance duty with desire, tradition with individuality, and sacrifice with survival. So, as we close our journey into the world of these princesses, let us remember them not merely as distant figures adorned in crowns, but as women who bore the weight of history upon their shoulders. They remind us that even in the most gilded cages, there is strength, and that even within the strictest boundaries, there can exist a spark of influence that endures across the centuries. And now, dear listener, may these echoes of the past settle gently in your mind, carrying you into a night of peace. Close your eyes, let the stories fade into quiet dreams, and sleep well. Good night.